month you look at the world through Sir Martin Sorrell's eyes on Storyboard. Well, this month you are still going to look at the world through Sir Martin Sorrell's eyes, except that we're coming to you from Davos at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, and the CEO of WPP is right here with me. Thank you very much for your time.
Delighted to be here with you, Menaka.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Davos.
Welcome to Davos. So what do you think is going to be the hot topic of conversation this year? There isn't any crisis, which is so nice.
I think that's, that's an interesting comment, because there still is, and I think we still have to be cautious. Well, certainly CEOs who run companies are cautious. I think that's one of the biggest things that we see is an unwillingness to take risk. And the slowing down of the fast growth markets, although they grow faster than the slow growth markets, if you follow what I'm trying to say, the slowing down, India being a good example of it, has made people more averse, risk averse. And some of the things that we're seeing in private equity, you can borrow money, WPP went into the market and borrowed at 5.1 and 5.6%, which means after tax it's 3%, which means you could buy a company for 33 times earnings and not feel the heat, which is a bit ludicrous, really. And whoever thought of an advertising agency going into the 30-year market? But some of those trends are making, I think, companies putting the pressure on. Activist investors are putting the pressure on. So the grey swans that you and I have talked about before, Eurozone, Middle East, hard soft landing in the BRICS, the US deficit issues, are still there. Now, I think the tendency at Davos, coming up to the heart of your question, is to focus on the big things, inequality, unemployment, climate, health, all water, all the sort of things that we should justifiably be thinking about. But I don't think crisis over is what we should automatically assume. Okay. And if you said to me, what's a long shot? We were asked at a breakfast this morning what a long shot. A long shot is to take our eyes off some of the fundamental issues that we had. And coming off the drug of cheap money is going to be a big issue in 2014. Tapering is going to be a conservative investment is the way I would put it in terms of client attitudes. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious. I don't think we want to be over-optimistic. The world economy will grow faster in 2014, all the pundits say, than 2013. So if real GDP growth last year was 3.5%, it might be 4% this year. Money terms, instead of being 4.5, 5 last year, might be 5, 5.5. That's sort of roughly where the analysts are. IMF yesterday said that Britain is going to grow faster, which is great for David Cameron going into an election in 2015. But there are some uncertainties around, but Davos will focus on the big issues. Inequality, unemployment, youth unemployment, I think being probably the two biggest. And the biggest problem, I think, that we have is that the technological advances that are being made are not labor intensive. In fact, they are labor dismissive in the sense of reducing labor inputs and increasing capital inputs. So the way the world economy, 3D printing. I went into an Italian optician in Rome and bought a 3D pair of spectacles, which is one piece. Now, if you just think it was designed by an Israeli architect, Ron Arad, who's quite well known, in London in his studio. Amazing if you think about what that means for manufacturing processes. So think 3D plus cheap energy in America. Those two things will drive the US economy. So I see it very much as a G2 world. Mm-hmm. Although, interestingly, 25th anniversary of CNBC, they looked at 25 years hence, and the data was, that China would be the world's biggest economy, not per capita, but biggest absolute terms, about 34 trillion versus 29 trillion for the US. And who's third? India third, 1.6 billion people in 25 years' time. China stagnant at 1.3, 1.4 billion. So really interesting. So India has a tremendously big role to play, but what's currently happening in India politically, of course, is not great.
You've got your eye on the elections in India?
Yeah, we've got our more than our eye. No, I just hope that there will be a decisive result. I fear there will not be a decisive result, that it will be a coalition, a balanced coalition, with no opportunity to exert strong leadership. I think what India needs is direction. And
Are you in the corner of any one
I'm not in any corner. We
the
are
BJP,
no,
the Modi-led BJP corner.
We're totally
the Rahul Gandhi-led
apolitical. Apolitical.
On camera, at least.
No. On camera and off camera.
Okay.
We have to be so. But there are clearly some political decisions being made, which, and in advance of election, I mean, you usually get that governments, government spending on communications. I'm not sure about India last year, but certainly there is a rule that we see in many, many countries, India notwithstanding, that the year before an election, the government's the biggest communications spender.
You've said China's the next big thing. George Soros says for 2014 that China is problem number one. Now, is this just a timeline thing?
Well,
you're looking at 10 years, he's looking at 12 months.
Than me, so I would go with his analysis, not mine. No, listen, I have tremendous faith in the new leadership. I think the Chinese, because the old leadership, the old Politburo, I think was it 4 people changed on the 12-man Politburo, because it's the old leadership that chooses new leadership. They're not in your face, if I can put it that way. They're not confrontational. Change comes gradually. But I think if you look at the plenum document, which is an amazing document as a plan, and the Chinese, monitor and follow it up. I mean, they establish their KPIs and they do follow it up.
Yeah.
If you look at the 12th five-year plan, and you look at the way the leadership is shaping up, the anti-corruption effort, very strong effort as well. I mean, one of the reasons why there isn't such a substantial presence here in Davos from China is because the anti-corruption, which has put a lot of people out of positions and some people in jail, etc. So I have tremendous confidence, faith. Our business in China is now $1.5 billion of revenue. India, we're just under 500 million. But if you look at it in terms of relatives, we have about 14,000 people now in India, and we have about 16,000, 15,000, 16,000 in China. So I'm talking about Greater China.
You got to China after you got to India, right?
Sorry?
You got to China after you got
No,
to
actually,
India? Or was it around the same period of time?
WPP, when we acquired JWT in '87, which was our first sort of Indian and Chinese incursion, and I've never, the implied thing is, you choose between the two. The answer is no, you do both. I think it would be very foolish for anybody to say they would exclude one or the other or favour one or the other, even given political uncertainties. I mean, I'm totally bullish on the future of India, totally bullish on its growth and development, and what happens in the context of 2014, that might be important to investment institutions or analysts, but long term, no.
I get that. Now, I fully understand that you've got to be in China and you've got to be in India and you've got to be in a bunch of new frontier markets, as they call it. But last night, at the PwC annual Global CEO Survey, of the 1,300 odd CEOs they surveyed, most of them said that we're looking beyond the BRICS for growth in the short to medium term. And so they listed Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand and Mexico. And so I'm just wondering,
I think
stay invested in India, but if you're putting additional money in, would it be India or would it be any of these countries?
It would be all of them. So, when we talk about
at 3%, I suppose
one third of our business is BRICS and next 11. It's the growth markets of Asia. It's not so much Japan and Australia, but it's the growth markets in between in Asia. It's Latin America, it's Africa and the Middle East, and Central and Eastern Europe. It's Poland and Russia and Ukraine and everywhere else. Because, coming back to the point, I think it would be, and I go as far as to say foolish, not to take the long-term view. I mean, if you look at the population statistics, whatever the PwC survey said, well, sure, if markets are slowing, but those fast growth markets are still growing faster. Our Brazilian business, our Chinese business last year up about same as India, 6-7%.
Okay.
Which is certainly more than we're seeing in GDP growth
anywhere else.
In the Western European. Not so much the UK. UK was stellar for us. Germany was okay. France, Italy, Spain, tougher. So naturally you go for and then we could say it's the next 11 because Iran is here. We're going to have the leader of Iran
that's
here.
going to be the biggest session, guys.
Amazing session. We'll have a private session with him later in the week. So it's a phenomenal. You see, I think that's good news, and I'm Jewish, and therefore I am concerned, obviously, about Israel's position. But if these moves are genuine, if the Iranian rapprochement, if I can put it like that, is genuine, which I'm hoping that it is, certainly, and I actually believe it is, then I think that's really good news. I mean, so we've seen the opening up of Myanmar. Maybe we're seeing a little bit of movement in Iran. I mean, Syria is still a big mess, but at least we've seen something on the chemical weapons. So who knows what might happen in Cuba in the longer run. North Korea we'll just put to one side for a minute, but there are some good things happening. I mean, I don't think we want to lose sight of this. I mean, we're obviously resolving the issues between Israel and Palestine are critically important too in the Middle Eastern context. But there are grounds for a little bit more optimism. I think that the Iranian thing is really positive news.
So what does all of this mean for advertising? I'm told that the share as a percentage of GDP has stayed where it was, and it hasn't grown. And I'm sure that's not very exciting for you. Even
the answer is it's tough but manageable. So this time last year, Menaka, if we were talking about our budgets, we would have said up 3% like for like. We did better than that. Market's looking for about 3.5%. We haven't announced our results. That's excluding currency and excluding acquisitions. You include those, revenues up 6 or 7%. So at the end of the day, it's okay. And if we look at 2014, we told the market that we'll be up by more than 3%. And our budgets are even more optimistic than that. We're sort of paring them back because we think people are being optimistic. But 3%, 4% is nothing to write home about in terms of like-for-like growth. And it reflects exactly what you said. I've given up trying to argue that advertising should rise as a proportion of GNP. I've come to the, sort of having once bitten, twice shy over the last 5 years, having had such a lot of aggravation over this. In the fast growth markets, it will continue to grow as a proportion GNP. I mean, in India, for example. In the slow growth markets, it will stay constant. Maybe it certainly hasn't recovered to pre-Lehman levels.
Okay.
And that's the problem. So, but as a whole, if you look at WPP's quarterly revenues and you compare it to GDP growth, either real or money, it's amazing how tight the correlation is since 2002 to 2003. We almost move in lockstep, 1-to-1, with GDP growth. That means that advertising as a proportion of GDP
has stayed
pretty much static. Now, WPP's GDP is not the world's GDP. So if the world is going to grow at 5.5% nominal, we're probably looking at about 3.5%, 4%, because although we have the biggest business in Asia Pacific, for example, it's not the weighting for the world economy. So in other words, even though we're very strong, we should be stronger.
Okay.
So you have to deflate worldwide GDP figures for the differences between WPP's pattern of geography and the world's
geographical
pattern.
presence deflator.
But in the fullness of time, I mean, I would hope that we would become the proxy, if you like, for worldwide GDP.
So you sound optimistic about 2014 in terms
I
of
feel better about 2014 than
prospects.
2013. But, the biggest problem that we face, I mean, on CNBC this morning they asked us to put on a chalkboard what the biggest risk for 2014 is, and I think it's conservative investment. Conservative investment in the sense that people are unwilling
to put money back to work.
To build brands. I mean, brands, Jeremy Bullmore, who used to be the chairman of JWC in the UK, is still an advisor to us, even at the tender age in his 80s. But some of the best people are 80, Rupert Murdoch, Warren Buffett, all in their 80s.
India's Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely. What we're saying is that the biggest challenge, and Jeremy said that building brands is like gardening. You have to tend to the plants, and you have to cultivate, and you have to fertilize. It's an investment. It's not a cost. And the problem is that finance and procurement has, I would say this, wouldn't I, too much power, and certainly more power than than they had before, and in some cases even more power than marketing. And that has pushed marketing, I think, off the agenda. We have to get marketing back on the agenda. We have to get people investing in brands because they believe that it's important. You know, in an internet-driven world, trust and brands, therefore brands, become even more important. Right? You know, who do I trust for my news?
So macro, it's looking better, but micro money is still not coming back to work?
Not as strongly as I think is necessary. See, clients are focused, they get to their targets by cutting costs, not by growing top-line revenue.
Right.
And coming back to the slowdown of the fast-growth markets, and this survey that you referred to, I mean, you know, Indonesia and Pakistan and
Vietnam.
Mexico and Colombia and Turkey and Nigeria, Indonesia, all these markets come to the fore. You know, if Iran is what, 80 million people? You know, roughly the same size as Vietnam, 85 million. So if you look at Myanmar, which was what, 60? So you've seen, you know, for 60 million consumers to drop from the sky, so to speak, is a big opportunity. And if Iran was to open up, that would be a big opportunity too. So I think, you know, we feel a little bit better. Not that there won't be crises, and I think we have to just be careful of that, assume that everything's good. But let's assume for a minute that it's slightly more stable than it was. That's good. GDP growth will be a little more, but it is small stuff. And in that environment, people are not willing to take risks.
All right, so final pop question, as I call it.
Yeah.
In advertising, what will be the big thing of 2014?
Well, you know, what we still see, it's the same boring pattern. Fast growth markets, BRICS and Next 11, take your PwC data. Digital, you know, digital is 35% of our business. Fast growth markets are a third of our business. We want them to each to be 40 to 45%.
Okay.
And last but not least, data and mobile. And data is now 25% of our business. Quantitative techniques are 50% of our business. You throw in digital. I mean, if the $18 billion of revenue that we have, $4 billion is in media planning and buying, media investment management. $4 billion is in data. And then there's another 6, so it's 14 out of 18. 6 is in digital, so 14 out of 18 is in digital, media, and data. Stuff that Don Draper, Mad Men, would not recognise. So I think you know, those are things. Now the other thing I think is really interesting is China. We tend to think that China in the West, you know, sort of a fabrication of the West. Well, not a fabrication. It's a view of the Western press. You know, almost the Western press doesn't want China to succeed, and the view is they steal, they copy. Now, we used to say the same thing about the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Hong Kong Chinese, and look what's happened. It's going to change. Xiaomi, internet telephone company, Tencent, Renren, Baidu are all going to be, I think, very significant forces. I mean, one thing that really caught my attention, I had assumed that Alibaba, the logistics platform,
right,
and the financial transaction platform would come out at $100 billion. I heard somebody say something like closer to $200 billion. Now, in its IPO, let's assume it's 100 for a minute. You've got Tencent at 100, you've got Baidu at 50. So these are big forces, even in comparison to a Google and an Apple and a Twitter
but are
and a
they
Facebook.
global forces? Because they're so localized in the way they work, no?
No. Xiaomi hired Hugo Barra from Android. It's an Android system. Hired him to take them international. They will not go, I think, to the markets where they would be fiercely competed with. They will go to the markets where they see big opportunities, maybe with idiosyncratic search systems in those markets. So markets that they feel they would have a competitive advantage, much more of a competitive advantage than going head-to-head, say, in the United States. Now, one little thing. I was in Mexico City, and one of our clients said, what is the most popular phone in smartphone in Latin America and in Mexico? And the answer was Alcatel's phone, which is made by HTC. So it's a Chinese phone.
Well, HTC is fairly popular in India as well, but it's a small segment, so I'll give them that.
But this is branded as Alcatel, and most of the consumers don't know it's a Chinese phone. So we just have to be careful that we're not just too critical and we're not too biased, because I think things are changing.
All right, so China remains opportunity number one and problem number one, depending on whether you believe Martin Sorrell or George Soros.
I would believe George Soros. He's much cleverer than I am.
All right, thank you, Martin,
Thank
so
you
much
very
for
much,
your
Menaka.
time.
Thank you.
Have a great year,
Thank you.
and we'll come back to you next month.
Thank you very much, Menaka.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.